How's my favorite class today? Today, boys and girls, we're going to talk about someone, a philosopher whose name, the mere mention of his name, indicates to most people a thought, or gives most people a thought of betrayal or a thought of deceit. And that's been like that for the last 500 years. Scholars attribute that to the use of his name by Shakespeare, and the use of his name to signify exactly what I just said, betrayal and deceit. So that's why this philosopher is known for exactly what I just said. He is known to be cunning. He is known to be unethical, unvirtuous, lack virtue. However, there are some scholars who think the absolute complete opposite. The philosopher we're going to talk about today, and statesman and political philosopher, is Niccolo Machiavelli. Niccolo Machiavelli was born in a small city-state in the north of Italy called Firenze, in Italian Florence. We call it Florence in English. Florence was a focal point in the era 1400s, late 1400s, early 1500s. And it was a focal point because this was the place that spawned the birth of what the Italians say, riscaldamento, what they say with the French word is a Renaissance. How we interpret it today in English is the Renaissance. The Renaissance got its start in Florence, Italy, in the late 1400s. There was a family that ruled Florence for a long time, over 50 years, the Medici. The Medici family managed to coalesce or bring together the arts, and they encouraged their development. They encouraged exploration into science. They encouraged rethinking of ancient ideologies, specifically the great thinkers of the past being the Greeks. Okay, so ancient Greek, ancient Roman ideas, the love of art, the love of statues. So it was a time of much carving, of much painting, and it was a time of much gravitation towards scientific explanation. Now you could see that would create distress in our society, because society in Europe in this time frame was based largely upon the understandings attributed or put forward by the Catholic Church. The Catholic Church had a huge control over Western Europe and Eastern Europe as well. And the Catholic Church could see change coming, and that created some strife. The scientific ideologies were becoming concepts of discussion amongst intellectuals, and sometimes when people fear education because it might undermine what they believe or what they think, or even worse, it might take away some of their power. So in the late 1400s, early 1500s, in Florence, Italy, there was an ongoing rebirth or renaissance, riscaldamento, we say in Italian. So this was the time that Niccolo Machiavelli was flourishing. His dad was a lawyer. His dad insisted that he have a quality education, and so he did. And soon after completion of his education, he became a statesman for the city-state of Florence. And that lasted for a little while, and then he ended up with a job as a military leader, as a general, which he did a pretty good job of from what history tells us. And things were changing rapidly in this part of the world. And actually, in most of Italy, things were changing rapidly. We had the Renaissance. We had new ideas coming into vogue. We had people like Galileo Galilei in the same time frame, who was developing stuff like telescopes, like microscopes, to see organisms that nobody ever thought even existed. So it was a time of great upheaval and great change. And in this time frame, Machiavelli Niccolo Machiavelli came into vogue. So he was originally a statesman, and that job ended, and then he became a general, and then that job ended. And then when the Medici took over power, they didn't trust him, so they tortured him for a little while, and they kicked him out of the city-state of Florence that he loved and defended his entire life. While in exile, he wrote several works. The one that I'm most familiar with is the one called The Prince. So Machiavelli wrote the treatise or book, The Prince. And what it is a roadmap. It's a guideline for how to become a prince, how to become a ruler of an area. And it lists very vividly how to do that. Now, it's been debated for the last 500 years. Why did Machiavelli, why did he write that? Why did he write such a book? It's in many ways very brutal. So why did he say that? There are a couple of schools of thought on that. There's one school of thought that, from the Hobbesian perspective, is that he did it so that the populace would be able to read his book and see how crooked, treacherous rulers actually come into power. Guys like Hitler, guys like Stalin, the techniques they use in order to gain power, to make us aware of the techniques they use. There's another school of thought that thinks he wrote the book so that people who would be good leaders could take that book and ascertain leadership. So whatever school of thought you look at, doesn't really matter, I guess. The bottom line is this: he wrote the book to help people attain leadership, or to be used to attain, or to show the steps one could use to attain leadership. And he did that. He did that using a technique that wasn't popular at the time, but has gained some credence in this time frame. It's using stories. He told stories he gave a technique that he felt should be followed. And then he gave stories through history, of people who used these techniques and achieved greatness, or who did not use these techniques and failed miserably. So what he offers in The Prince is basically an historical text compounded with the ideology of how to attain leadership roles. Now, it should be noted that some of the ideologies that Machiavelli was pushing forward would not be considered good by most measures. Good, I guess we could use the term virtuous, would not be considered virtuous. Now, earlier in the course, we learned about virtue because it was discussed greatly primarily amongst the three big philosophers we discussed in ancient Greece: Socrates, Plato, and Aristotle. Virtue was one of the things, was pivotal in their focus, in their ideology. Machiavelli's interpretation of virtuous is quite a bit different than theirs. It's quite a bit different than what the Catholic Church at the time frame viewed to be virtuous, than what probably the populace aspired to as virtuous. Machiavelli's view, he was quoted as using the terminology criminal virtue, meaning that he believed that in order to be a good ruler, you had to practice criminal virtues. You had to do things that were not good. But if you did those things that were not good, the outcome was that the state would become stable. And if you have a stable state, you have a better opportunity to have more relaxed citizens, and they are less likely to overthrow you. And that's pretty much a focus. Now, some of the stories that Machiavelli used in The Prince. In chapter 7, he talks about, just to give you an example, he talks about, what was the man's name? Borgia, gentleman Borgia, who came to power partly because of his dad, and he took over not Romania, what was the name of that? He took over a region, and he was having difficulty with the region because he found the region to be lawless, and they were not paying attention to his ordinances, and he didn't like this. So, following what Machiavelli would consider to be great ideology, what he did was he went in and he used violence. And Machiavelli was a proponent of using, supported the use of violence to achieve an ends. And he was often quoted as saying, the ends justifies the means. So if what he did brought about peace and stability, it was worth it. So Borgia followed the same ideology. He went into the area that he was having issue with, a recently conquered area, and he actually didn't do it himself. He sent in one of his guard dogs, a guy named Orco, who was a missionary. Sorry, I misspoke. Not a missionary. Who was a mercenary. Mercenaries were in use to a great extent during the Middle Ages, 1400s into the Renaissance, 1500s. Mercenaries were used on a regular basis by rulers because they were well trained. Mercenaries are just armies for hire. I said missionaries. I misspoke. They're two entirely different things. Missionaries and mercenaries. Missionaries push peace and love and God, the Word of God. Mercenaries push do as I say or we kill everybody. They were an army. So Borgia sent into the region that he overtook his top mercenary. Orco was the guy's name. And Orco went in under cover of darkness very swiftly. And anybody that was a rebel rouser in the area, anybody that was creating strife or mischief, he rounded them up and he lopped their heads off in front of their families, or he brutally killed them. And it soon brought peace to the region. Nobody wanted to do anything to offend Orco. So peace and stability came soon afterwards. Now, Borgia was a pretty intelligent guy, and he realized that, Orca was becoming very powerful, and he was feared. But the people seemed to fear Orca more than they feared him, Borgia. So he said, I think I should set the record straight. So he invited Borgia out to supper, I believe is how it went. And when he was walking to his supper, he was grabbed and he was taken to the town square, where he was hung up by each of his legs, and they took a big saw and they sawed him right down the middle. They sawed him into two pieces. So the two pieces of him hung in the square of this area for a while. And Borgia did that because he believed it would send a message. It would send a message to the populace that A, he was the real tough guy, and B, if anybody messed with him, they would end up like that. Hence the premise that people believe that the prince gives an overall ideology that it is better to be feared than loved. Fear lasts longer. Now, that's a common quote that you hear, like especially in the 90s. There was a lot of movies about the mafia, the Italian mafia, and they based the mafia on Machiavelli, and his quote often comes up: "It is better to be feared than loved." I think that was a discussion in the movie The Godfather, actually. So that quote comes from Machiavelli: "Better to be feared than loved. Fear lasts longer." The story from Borgia was the one that I brought to talk about. So you would have an understanding of what The Prince is actually about. It's a book that lists a bunch of stories to use for leaders to use to guide them towards proper leadership. Machiavelli considered proper leadership to be someone who might use violence, but he uses it swiftly and he uses it fast, and then he does away with it. He doesn't use violence. He thinks using it in excess causes people to think you have a bloodlust, and they will be scared to the point where they will not follow you. They will rebel against you at the first opportunity. But if you use violence sparingly and justly, and then afterwards you celebrate life, he says most of the people will follow you. And back to the Borgia story, what Borgia did after he cut Orca in two pieces, Orco in two pieces, and hung them in a square, just afterwards he organized big parties. He got cheap grain imported into the region so people could eat relatively cheaply. He dropped taxes, and he had festivals. And the people, even though they might have feared him, they respected him enough just to follow his orders and not cause any problems. And Machiavelli says that's what you want to achieve as a ruler. You don't want to be good as a ruler. You want to build a society where everything functions together without causing too much strife. That's it for my overview of Machiavelli. I hope you enjoyed it, and we'll talk in class. See you later, everybody.